The setup, Chapter 1. The first thing Wren Callahan lost was his job. The second thing was his name. The third thing, the thing that took longest to go, the thing that clung to him like smoke in fabric, was his belief that Adrian Cho had ever loved him at all. It started on a Tuesday. Wren remembered because Tuesdays had always been quiet at Havorson and Cho Capital. The kind of quiet that let him get real work done instead of performing productivity for people who mistook noise for competence. He'd been at his desk for 6 years. He knew the rhythm of that office the way he knew the back of his own hands. Which elevator stuck on the 9th floor, which conference room had the good coffee machine, which of his colleagues actually meant it when they said good morning. He did not know that Tuesday that 2 federal auditors were already sitting in the glass conference room on the 14th floor, reviewing a paper trail that led, with surgical precision, directly to his name. Wren Callahan. The head of compliance said his name like it was something she'd found on the bottom of her shoe. "We need you to come upstairs." He remembered the walk to that conference room in fragments, the hush that fell over the trading floor as he passed, the way his own reflection kept flashing back at him in the glass walls, distorted and stretched, like a preview of the man he was about to become in everyone's eyes. Fraud, embezzlement. 3 years of falsified client statements funneling capital into offshore accounts that traced back, eventually, impossibly, to a shell company with his social security number quietly buried in its founding documents. He hadn't opened that shell company. He hadn't touched those accounts. He had, in fact, spent the better part of those 3 years falling in love with the man who ran the department 3 floors above his, Adrian Cho, golden boy, heir apparent. The kind of charming that made boardrooms go soft and juries go blind. Wren didn't understand it yet. Not fully. Not on that Tuesday, sitting across from 2 auditors who spoke to him like he was already convicted, his hands cuffed to a metal table that had never held a criminal before him and would hold plenty after. He didn't understand that the man he'd shared a bed with for 2 years, the man whose coffee order he knew by heart, whose nightmares he'd learned to soothe at 3 in the morning, whose ring he had, God help him, actually considered wearing one day, had spent those same 2 years quietly building the exact paper trail that would end his career, his reputation, and very nearly his freedom. He found out about the engagement from a headline. 3 months after the charges were dropped, not cleared, because the firm settled quietly to avoid the noise of a real trial, because guilt by association was easier to manage than justice. 3 months after his name had been dragged through enough mud to bury a smaller man, Wren opened his phone to see Adrian Cho's face smiling out from a society page. Adrian Cho, rising star of Havorson and Cho Capital, announces engagement to Julian Reyes, of the Reyes shipping family. Wren stared at that photo for a long time. Adrian's arm around a man Wren had never seen before, tall, dark-haired, with the kind of quiet, guarded handsomeness that photographed like a held breath. Julian Reyes didn't smile the way Adrian did. His smile looked like something rationed. Wren would think about that later, how a man could look so uneasy in a photo meant to announce the happiest news of his life. But in that first moment, all he felt was something colder and older than heartbreak. He felt certainty. Adrian Cho hadn't destroyed Wren's life over an argument, or jealousy, or any of the small human reasons people burned each other down. He'd done it because Wren was in the way of something. And now there was a new man in Adrian's life. A rich one, from an old money shipping family with the kind of assets that made small fortunes look like pocket change. And Wren's ruined instincts, the ones that used to close 9-figure deals before breakfast, were screaming the same word over and over. Next, Chapter 2. The plan it took Wren 4 months to build a version of himself that could walk back into that world without shaking. He'd used the settlement money, hush money, really, though the lawyers called it something gentler, to disappear for a while. Not far, just far enough. A studio apartment 2 train lines from where he used to live, a name that was technically still his but that he wore now like a stranger's coat. He spent those 4 months doing 2 things. Rebuilding the version of himself that could pass as unbothered in rooms full of people who used to pity him, and reading everything he could find about Julian Reyes. Julian, it turned out, was not what the tabloids made him look like. He didn't attend the parties his family's name got him invited to. He ran a small maritime logistics consultancy that had nothing to do with his father's empire, built quietly, without the family name attached, until a reporter dug it up 2 years in. He gave, anonymously at first, to a scholarship fund for kids of dockworkers. He had, according to one old profile buried on page 6 of a search result, once punched a photographer who tried to get a picture of his mother at her own mother's funeral. He did not look, in any of the research Wren did, like a man who deserved to be collateral damage in someone else's revenge. Wren almost stopped there. He told himself that later, many times in the months that followed, that there had been a moment early on where he could have closed the laptop and let it go, let Adrian have his money and his shipping heir and his charming, hollow future. But grief has a way of curdling into something with teeth, and Wren had 3 years of his life to account for. 3 years of falsified statements with his name laundered through them. A settlement that had bought his silence instead of his vindication. A mother who still cried when she thought he couldn't hear, because she'd had to explain to her book club why her son wasn't at the firm anymore. He didn't want Adrian's money. He wanted the truth, filed somewhere it couldn't be settled away. And the only way to get it, he'd realized somewhere around month 3, staring at bank records he had no legal right to be looking at, was to get close enough to the one person in Adrian's new life who might actually still have a conscience. The plan, when he finally wrote it down, looked almost absurdly simple. Get close to Julian Reyes. Find out what Julian knows about the shell company. Find the real trail, the one that leads to Adrian, not away from him. Bring it all down before the wedding. He did not write down, don't fall for him. It hadn't occurred to him yet that this would be a rule he'd need. Chapter 3. The approach the maritime consultancy Julian ran occupied the 11th floor of a building that had none of the gleam of Havorson and Cho's headquarters. Brick, exposed pipes. The kind of deliberate unpretentiousness that Wren recognized immediately as its own kind of wealth. He'd rehearsed the encounter a dozen times. New name, Wren went by his middle name now, Elias, on any document that mattered, new resume. 3 years of gap explained away with a vague consulting stint abroad that no one could easily verify. A meeting requested through a mutual industry contact who owed Wren a favor from a previous life. He hadn't expected Julian Reyes to be funny. You're either very good at your job or very good at lying about it, Julian said, 20 minutes into their first meeting, after Wren had walked him through a supply chain optimization pitch that was, admittedly, half theater. I can't tell which yet. Can it be both? Wren said, and something in Julian's face shifted, not quite a smile, but the ghost of one, held back like he wasn't sure it was allowed. It usually is, Julian said. That's the problem with people who are good at their jobs. Wren had walked in there prepared to perform charm the way Adrian had always performed it, smooth, magnetic, a little too polished to be entirely trustworthy. He'd expected to have to work for Julian's attention. What he hadn't expected was how quickly Julian saw through the performance, not the false name or the fabricated resume. Those held, for now, but the layer underneath, the exhaustion Wren hadn't managed to fully bury. You look tired, Julian said, near the end of that first meeting in a tone that wasn't quite concern and wasn't quite nothing. Not in the way people usually look tired in these offices, something else. Long few years, Wren said. It was unfortunately the most honest thing he'd say in that entire meeting. Julian studied him a moment too long before he nodded and let it go. Aren't they always? Wren left that first meeting with a follow-up appointment on the calendar and a strange, unwelcome awareness settling into his chest. The sense that Julian Reyes was not going to be an easy man to use. Chapter 4. The second time it took 6 weeks of manufactured business meetings, 3 shared lunches that started as work and ended somewhere murkier, and 1 long night stranded together at the office during a citywide blackout, before Wren admitted to himself that this was no longer entirely a performance. The blackout was an accident of timing he hadn't planned and couldn't have. A summer storm knocked out half the grid on the east side of the city, and Julian's building, old, stubborn, run on infrastructure that predated modern redundancy planning, went dark along with it. Wren had been in Julian's office reviewing contract language when the lights cut out, and in the sudden dark, before either of their phones lit up as flashlights, there had been one unguarded second where neither of them said anything at all. Well, Julian said into the quiet, and Wren heard the smile in his voice before the phone light found his face and confirmed it. This is dramatic. They ended up on the floor of his office, backs against his desk, sharing the last granola bar Julian kept in a drawer for emergencies, talking with the specific looseness of 2 people who'd been circling something for weeks and had finally run out of pretexts not to. Can I ask you something? Julian said, somewhere around midnight, when the emergency lighting had kicked in and painted everything the color of an old photograph. And you don't have to answer if it's I don't know. Too much, go ahead. Are you happy doing this? The consulting that he gestured vaguely at the space between them, at the whole architecture of Wren's fabricated life. I don't know. You have this thing you do, where you talk about your work like it's a costume you're wearing. I've never met anyone who talks about their job like that unless something happened to the job they actually wanted. Wren's chest went tight. He thought about lying. He'd been lying for 6 weeks, effortlessly, the way you lie when the truth would end everything before it started. But something about the dark, and the granola bar wrapper crinkling in Julian's hands, and the particular gentleness in the question. Not curious in the way people usually were curious about him, but careful, like Julian already suspected the answer might cost something to give, made the lie stick in his throat. Something happened, Wren said finally. I used to do something else. It ended badly. I don't really talk about it. Okay, Julian said simply and didn't push. Just okay. Like Wren's pain was allowed to exist without being interrogated for it. For what it's worth, whatever happened, I don't think it's the last thing you'll ever be good at. Wren didn't answer that. He couldn't. He sat in the dark next to the man he was supposed to be using as a means to an end, and felt something in his careful architecture of revenge begin, quietly, to crack. Chapter 5. The fiancé Adrian Cho was, as far as Wren could tell from the outside, exactly the man he'd always been, golden, charming, utterly convinced of his own righteousness. Wren saw him twice in those first months, both times from a careful distance. Once at an industry gala Julian had invited him to as a +1, no pressure, but the food's actually good. And once at a restaurant Wren had specifically chosen not to be at, except that Adrian and Julian happened to be seated at the next table, and Wren had frozen in the doorway long enough for the hostess to ask if he was all right. At the gala, Adrian hadn't recognized him. Wren had changed enough, different glasses, a haircut, 4 months of a diet born mostly from stress rather than vanity, a new name that Adrian had no reason to connect to the ghost of a man he'd buried under fraud charges. Wren had watched him work a room the way he always had, one hand on Julian's back, guiding him through introductions like Julian was an asset to be displayed rather than a person to be present with. He does that, Julian said later in the car when Wren asked, carefully, gently, testing the ground, how long he and Adrian had been together. Introduces me like I'm I don't know, a merger. My father loves him for it. Adrian's very good at making people feel like the most important person in the room, right up until you notice he does it to everyone. Does that bother you? Wren asked. Julian was quiet for a long moment, looking out the window at the city sliding past. I used to think it was just how he showed love, big and public and a little performative. My family's like that too, so I thought, I don't know. I thought I understood the shape of it. He paused. Lately, I'm not sure I do. Wren filed that away with the careful precision of a man building a case and hated himself a little for how much he also just wanted to reach over and take Julian's hand. Chapter 6. What Julian knew. The break came 4 months into the plan, on a night Wren hadn't engineered at all. Julian showed up at Wren's apartment, the real one, the small one, not the version of his life Wren had curated for this operation. A little after 11, unannounced, a bottle of wine in one hand and something unreadable in his face. I found something, Julian said, before Wren had even fully opened the door. In Adrian's home office. I wasn't looking, I swear, I was just looking for a stapler of all the stupid things, and there was a drive, labeled with initials that weren't his. Wren's pulse spiked so hard he was sure Julian could hear it. What initials? WC, Julian said, and watched Wren's face very, very carefully as he said it. Does that mean anything to you? There it was. The moment Wren had built 4 months toward, arriving not on his terms but on Julian's in his own kitchen, at 11 at night, with a man whose trust Wren had been carefully, methodically earning for a purpose Julian didn't yet know existed. He could still lie. He'd lied about smaller things for months. One more wouldn't cost much more than his conscience. But Julian was still watching him, that same careful, unguarded expression from the blackout night, the one that had made Wren's whole plan start to crack in the first place, and something in Wren simply gave out. My name isn't Elias, Wren said. It's Wren Callahan. He watched the name land. Watched Julian's expression cycle through confusion, then recognition. The society pages had covered the scandal distantly 3 years ago, and Julian had a memory sharp enough to place it. And then something that looked almost like grief. Wren Callahan, Julian repeated slowly. The fraud case, the one that got settled before trial. I didn't do it, Wren said, and heard how it sounded. How everyone accused always sounds desperate and predictable, but pressed on anyway because there was nothing left to lose by being honest now. Adrian did it. He built the shell company, laundered the accounts, put my name on the founding documents because I was convenient, because I trusted him, because I would never have thought to check whether the man I loved was setting me up to take a fall that would let him walk into a partnership clean. His voice cracked on the last word, and he let it. I lost my job, my name. 3 years of my life fighting a case I couldn't even take to trial because the firm settled it out from under me to protect its own reputation. And then 4 months later, I saw his engagement announcement in a headline and I thought, he stopped. You thought you'd get close to me, Julian finished quietly, to find whatever he actually did, to finally prove it. Yes, Wren said. There was no version of this that survived a lie now. That's how this started. Julian was quiet for a long time, long enough that Wren's heart had time to fully break in the silence, certain he'd just lost the one relationship in 4 months that had felt like it might mean something separate from the revenge that built it. And how does it end? Julian asked, finally. Now. I don't know, Wren admitted. I didn't plan for you to be, he gestured helplessly at the space between them, echoing Julian's own gesture from the blackout night. I didn't plan for any of this to be real. Julian set the wine bottle down on the counter, very carefully, like he needed something to do with his hands. Show me the drive, he said. Not the one at his house, I can't get that again without him noticing. But whatever you've built, whatever case you have, show me everything. If he did this to you, I want to see the proof myself, not because I don't believe you, I do, God help me, I already do, but because I need to look at it with my own eyes before I let it change my entire life. Chapter 7. The trail they spent the next 3 weeks building the case together, which was, Wren thought more than once, a stranger intimacy than anything false he'd manufactured in the 4 months before. There is a particular closeness that comes from 2 people staring at the same spreadsheet at 2 in the morning, tracing wire transfers through shell companies with names like Halcyon Maritime Holdings and Blue Water Consolidated Trust, watching a story assemble itself out of numbers that had, until now, only ever pointed toward Wren's guilt. Julian had access Wren never could have gotten alone. Not just the physical drive, carefully photographed page by page on a night Adrian was traveling for work, but a working knowledge of the financial architecture that connected Adrian's firm to his family's shipping empire. A connection Wren hadn't fully understood until Julian laid it out. He didn't just frame you to protect himself, Julian said one night, spreading printouts across Wren's kitchen table like tarot cards forecasting a disaster. Look, this shell company, the one with your name on the founding documents. It's not just laundering money out of client accounts. It's routing capital into a series of shipping contracts that undercut my father's company specifically. Adrian's been using the firm to quietly starve out my family's competitors and consolidate freight routes onto shell entities he controls. The fraud against you wasn't the whole plan. It was a byproduct, a convenient scapegoat he could sacrifice when the auditors got close, so the real trail never led back to him. He needed someone to take the fall, Wren said, the pieces settling into place with a click that felt almost physical. Someone with access to the accounts, someone he could plausibly frame, someone whose ruin wouldn't cost him anything real. Someone he could control the story around, Julian said quietly, because you loved him. Because you'd have every incentive to just disappear quietly instead of fighting, once your name was already dragged through it. He didn't just use the fraud, Wren, he used you, specifically, because you were close enough to be convenient and in love enough not to see it coming. Wren sat with that for a long moment, feeling something shift in his chest, not quite relief, not quite fresh grief, but a kind of clarity that felt, after 3 years of confusion, almost peaceful. And you, he said slowly. Why you? Why the engagement? Julian's jaw tightened. Because my father's company is the biggest remaining competitor to whatever Adrian's actually building. Marrying me doesn't just give him my family's name, it gives him a direct line into restructuring my father's freight contracts from the inside. I thought he loved me. His voice cracked just slightly on the last word, an echo of Wren's own break weeks earlier. I think now I was just the next acquisition. They looked at each other across the kitchen table, 2 men who had each, separately, been loved by the same person as a means to an end. And something between them, already tender, already dangerous, deepened into something neither of them had a plan for anymore. Chapter 8. The almost undoing it nearly fell apart on a Thursday, 3 weeks before the wedding, when Adrian showed up at Julian's office unannounced and found Wren's jacket draped over the back of a chair that had no reason to have it. Whose is this? Adrian asked, in the light, easy tone Wren remembered from years of shared mornings. The tone that used to mean nothing was wrong, right up until it always did. "A consultant," Julian said, and Wren, listening from the hallway where he'd frozen mid-step at the sound of Adrian's voice, felt his whole body go cold at how steady Julian sounded. "Elias. He's been helping restructure the Pacific routes." "Elias," Adrian repeated, and something in the way he said the name made Wren's pulse spike. Not recognition, not yet, just the low hum of a man whose instincts, however corrupted, were still sharp. "I'd like to meet him. Anyone who has that much access to your restructuring plans should probably meet the man you're marrying." Wren had exactly 11 seconds, standing in that hallway, to decide whether to walk in and risk everything or disappear, and let 3 weeks of careful evidence-building collapse under the weight of a single unplanned encounter. He walked in. "Elias," Julian said, and Wren watched him perform a calm that must have cost him everything. "This is Adrian, my fiancé." Adrian's eyes moved over Wren's face with the particular scrutiny of a man cataloging a stranger. The glasses, the different haircut, 4 months of a harder jaw than the one he used to trace with his thumb in the mornings. And for one long, suspended moment, Wren was certain he was about to be recognized, right there, with none of the evidence yet secured, none of the case yet airtight. "Nice to meet you," Adrian said, finally, extending a hand with the easy charm of a man who suspected nothing at all. "Julian doesn't usually bring consultants home in his conversations. You must be good." "I try," Wren said, and shook the hand of the man who destroyed his life and did not let a single tremor show. Adrian held the handshake a beat too long, or maybe Wren only imagined it did, adrenaline distorting time the way it always did in moments that mattered, and then let go, and turned back to Julian with the easy, possessive charm Wren remembered so well. "Don't work too late," Adrian said, pressing a kiss to Julian's temple that made Wren's stomach turn. "The Hendersons want to confirm the seating chart by Friday." He left. Wren didn't breathe again until the elevator doors had fully closed behind him. "He didn't recognize you?" Julian said, once the office was empty, his hands visibly shaking now that the performance was over. "I thought for a second it was over." "So did I," Wren admitted. Julian looked at him for a long moment, something raw and unguarded breaking through the composure he'd held for Adrian's benefit. "I can't keep doing this," he said. "Not the case. I still want the truth. I want him exposed. I want my father to know what's actually been done to his company. But I can't keep standing in a room with him, letting him kiss me, planning a wedding to a man who did that to you, while feeling—" He stopped. "While feeling what?" Wren asked, though some part of him already knew, had known for weeks, had been carefully not naming it because naming it made it real and real things could be lost. "While feeling like the person I actually want in the room is you," Julian said. Chapter 9. The confession they didn't kiss that night. Wren wanted it with an intensity that scared him a little given everything this had started as, but some part of him needed to say the truth first, all of it, before he let himself have anything real. "I need you to know something," Wren said. Once they were back at his apartment, the case files spread across the table between them like a wall neither of them had quite decided to tear down. "When this started, I wasn't lying to you about the work. The consulting was real, the pitches were real. But the reason I walked into your office in the first place, the reason I learned everything about your family, your business, your schedule, before I ever said a word to you, that wasn't about you. It was about him. I built a version of myself specifically designed to get close to you because I thought you'd be the fastest way to the truth." "I know," Julian said. "You know." "I've known since the drive," Julian said. "I'm not stupid, Wren. I've spent my whole life being someone people wanted access to, my father's name, my family's money, the version of me that's useful for a merger. I recognized the shape of it in you almost immediately, if I'm honest. He paused, searching for the right words. "I kept waiting for the moment it would feel like just that, like I was only ever the means to an end. And it never came. Every time I thought that's all this was, you'd do something that didn't fit the story, staying up all night with me over spreadsheets when the case had nothing left to give you that night. Asking about my mother's funeral like you actually wanted to know the answer, not because it was useful. I don't think you started this as anything real, but I don't think it stayed that way, did it?" "No," Wren said, and it was the easiest true thing he'd said in months. "It didn't stay that way at all." Chapter 10. The wedding they decided in the end not to burn it down quietly. Wren had spent 3 years imagining 100 versions of revenge, anonymous tips to journalists, packets of evidence mailed to regulators, a quiet, surgical unmaking of Adrian's career that would leave Wren's own name clean and Adrian's utterly destroyed. But sitting across from Julian, 3 weeks before a wedding that was never going to happen, he found himself wanting something different. Not just Adrian's ruin, but the truth, out in the open, in front of every person who'd ever doubted Wren, in front of the auditors who'd cuffed him to a table without ever really looking for another name. They chose the rehearsal dinner, not the wedding itself. Julian was firm on that, not wanting his mother's carefully planned evening turned into a public spectacle. But the smaller, quieter rehearsal, where the people who mattered most, including two of the original auditors from Wren's case whom Julian's family lawyer had quietly, legally, invited back to review, a matter of financial interest to the Reyes family, would all be in one room. Wren stood at the back of that room, 3 years and 4 months after the worst day of his life, and watched Adrian Cho's face as Julian's family lawyer laid out, page by page, a case that led cleanly, unambiguously, with a paper trail that this time couldn't be settled away, directly to the man himself. "This is absurd," Adrian said, his charm fraying at the edges for the first time Wren had ever witnessed. "This is some kind of setup." "Yes," Julian said, standing finally at Wren's side rather than at Adrian's. "It is. Just not the one you think." Adrian's eyes moved to Wren, really looked at him, this time past the glasses and the haircut and 4 months of a harder jaw, until recognition finally fully landed. "Wren," Adrian said, and something in his voice cracked open, not quite an apology, not quite anything as clean as remorse, but something that had once resembled love. "You did all this? You did all this," Wren said. "3 years ago, I just finally finished the story you started." Chapter 11. After the case took another 8 months to fully resolve, the wheels of financial fraud investigations grind slowly, even with airtight evidence. But this time there was no quiet settlement, no hush money, no version of the story that let Adrian Cho walk away untouched. His name made headlines instead of Wren's. The firm that had once settled Wren's case out from under him now scrambled to distance itself from Adrian entirely. And in the strange, unfair calculus of public reputation, that distancing did more to clear Wren's name than 3 years of silent suffering ever had. Julian's father, humiliated and furious in equal measure at how close his company had come to being quietly gutted from the inside, offered Wren a position, not out of charity. He was careful to clarify, but because anyone who can build a case like that deserves a seat at the table, not a settlement to disappear. Wren took it, not because he needed the redemption, though it helped, but because for the first time in 3 years, he woke up in the morning without the low, constant hum of injustice sitting in his chest like a stone. He and Julian didn't rush anything. There was too much to untangle first: a broken engagement, a public scandal, the particular grief of loving someone who'd never really loved you back, even if that someone wasn't either of them exactly, but the ghost of a man they'd both, in different ways, given years to. But 6 months after the rehearsal dinner that ended one wedding and started something neither of them had planned for, Wren found himself standing in Julian's kitchen. The real one. The too big one with the granola bars still in the emergency drawer from the blackout, watching Julian cook something that smelled like it was going to be terrible, and loving him anyway. "I keep waiting for it to feel like it started wrong," Julian said without looking up from the stove. "For that to matter, that you came into my life because of him, not because of me." "It did start wrong," Wren said, coming up behind him, resting his chin on Julian's shoulder in a gesture that had become, somewhere in the last 6 months, entirely unremarkable between them. "But I don't think that's the part that matters anymore." No, Wren said. "I think what matters is that everything true between us happened despite how it started, not because of it." He pressed a kiss to the curve of Julian's neck, feeling him relax into it the way he always did now, unguarded in a way Wren suspected very few people had ever gotten to see. "He built a version of both our lives to use us, and somehow out of the wreckage of that, we built something real anyway. I don't know what that says about either of us, but I know it's the only good thing that's come out of the last 4 years. Julian turned in his arms, finally, the terrible-smelling dinner forgotten on the stove behind him. "For what it's worth," he said, "I'd take the wreckage. If it ends here, it doesn't end here," Wren said. "This is just where it starts being ours." Epilogue 1 year later. The scholarship fund Julian ran quietly for dockworkers' children had a new name that year, the Callahan Reyes Fund, over Wren's initial objection and Julian's absolute insistence. And its first major donor, ironically, was a settlement paid out by Adrian Cho's now-defunct firm, redirected by court order into restitution for the fraud his schemes had caused, both to Wren and to the smaller shipping companies quietly starved out over 3 years of manipulated contracts. Wren still thought about Adrian sometimes, Not with the raw, consuming anger of that first year, but with the distant, almost clinical curiosity of a man looking back at a stranger who used to wear his face. He'd learn, eventually, that people who build their lives on other people's ruin rarely learn anything from losing everything. Adrian's appeals dragged on for years, his charm working less and less on juries who'd seen the paper trail laid out in black and white. But that story belonged to someone else now. Wren's story, the one that mattered, the one he was actually living, had a kitchen with a terrible cook in it, a granola bar drawer that had become a running joke neither of them would ever explain to guests, and a love that had started as a means to an end and become, against every plan either of them had made, the entire point. And